Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Christian Wolmar. Having tackled the history of the railways in Britain in Fire and Steam, he's now turned his attention to a much bigger vista. In Blood, Iron and Gold, he looks at how the railways transformed every aspect of our forebears' lives, from the way that war was conducted and the goods that stacked the shelves, to the way that time was kept and how national identities were forged. Despite the impact of the railways on society at large, writing about them has largely been confined to what Christian refers to as the Rivet counters. I asked him why he thought this was so.
Well, I think the people I call the Rivet counters have actually camped on the territory and almost excluded people. It's almost somewhat nerdy to be interested in railways. I mean, my kids only semi-jokingly think I'm a train spotter. And I'm most definitely not a train spotter. I was a train spotter when I was a kid, but as I said in one of my previous books, once I got interested in girls, I soon lost interest. I think that by painting an image of anyone who's interested in railways as being sort of anarchy and standing at the end of platforms with notebooks and pencils, it's rather disguised the fact that there is a much better, more important, more interesting, rich story to be told. And I've tried to sort of inhabit that territory.
Now, going all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century when the railways were beginning to come into being, I was very struck by the rapidity of the spread of the railways. It seemed to me that after millennia, when the horse was the fastest thing that humans could travel with, the world was ready for this, and it didn't take much pushing to get the railways to really catch on.
Everything was right. The preconditions were right. The railways happened because of the Industrial Revolution, had created the engineering possibilities to make locomotives, and then going backwards from that in the other direction in a way, because that technology was available, then therefore society was ready to embrace this new invention and to fund it and finance it. Those institutions were building up at the same time. There was economic growth again in both directions, both stimulated by the railways, and the railways stimulated economic growth. So I think there was this fantastic two-way process of the railways generating growth and growth being generated, and therefore leading to the construction of the railways. So they allow the spread of industrialization. And once capitalism started taking a hold in that way, capitalism needs growth and development, and it was clear that the railways were the way that it was going to come about, both for the railways themselves, which had an enormous impact on the economy, and for the growth they stimulated. So it was a win-win situation, as it were.
And I thought it was fascinating, the fact that very early on in the whole development of the railways, two distinct models emerge. You've got the Anglo-Saxon model, if you like, which you describe, I think, as pure raw capitalism, which is about free enterprise and companies setting up on their own. And you've got the European model, which is all about central state planning.
Yes, absolutely. And it's still the same, isn't it? I mean, it's still the same that Britain and America has a different model of economic management than Europe. And nowhere is this more shown than in the railways, where all the main European countries had a much stronger state involvement, and some that the state, like in Belgium, the state was actually the developer of the railways, planned out a system, but nowhere were the railways allowed to develop in a sort of free enterprise way that they were in America and the UK. There was always much more state involvement, much more rational system. And oddly enough, as I write in the book, even in India, which was a British colony, the railways were planned out and say, well, we're going to have a railway between Calcutta and Delhi, and a railway between Delhi and Bombay, and that's the plan for it. Some of it might be being built by private enterprise, and of course a lot of it was built by contractors, which were not state-owned, of course. But it was planned in a way that Britain never planned its railways.
And so the railway can actually become an expression of national identity, or a way of forging a national identity, as in nascent nations like Italy, for example.
Absolutely. Both Italy and Germany did not exist in their present form when railways started being built, and both of them were definitely pulled together by the railways, and so they were, say, in Argentina. You can go there, and they use the railways to inhabit distant lands and forge the country into a coherent whole. And Russia, which is probably the most significant in terms of the engineering example, the Trans-Siberian Railway was a development that was promoted by people who wanted to see Russia as a coherent whole and not with a sort of big, strong regional flavour, with Siberia very, very distant from the rest of the country.
You mentioned Russia, and that brings me to the issue of gauge, which you say early on in the book. This may sound like a rivet counters kind of issue, but in fact gauge is very important. And I thought it was fascinating the way you discussed the possibility that the siege of Leningrad might have gone differently had gauge of the railways actually been compatible between Europe and Russia.
There's some dissenters to this view, but I subscribe to it quite strongly, that the Russians deliberately chose a different gauge to protect themselves. So did, oddly enough, the Spanish. So the countries at the extremes of Europe chose a gauge that was different, so that they couldn't be invaded by people using the railways very quickly. The whole hassle of transshipping goods and stuff at railheads made that very difficult. And so it proved. The Germans did struggle to invade Russia in the Second World War, precisely because they had to transship goods, and they busily remodeled Poland's railways onto standard gauge, and were trying to build move the rails as they kind of headed east, but it proved very difficult to do. And yes, so it was one of the things that slowed down their advance, and maybe fatally so.
We're discussing war, and I wanted to ask you about the blood of the title. Where does the blood come in?
The iron is obviously the railways. The blood is just it's not so much war, although railways do play a huge role in wars, but it's much more the number of lives lost in this process. I mean, these railways were built with great haste at a very early time. Technology was pretty basic. It was manpower. It was navvies, men with shovels, very often with no other earth-moving equipment, who built them, and also took enormous risk, particularly those building tunnels, where eventually they did get explosives later on and would often blow themselves up or whatever. People falling down mountains, people dying of disease. The railways, the most difficult railways are those in the tropical zones, the ones in Mozambique and what is now Zimbabwe, the ones in Panama, some of them in India, where death tolls from disease were absolutely enormous. I mean, the saddest one that I uncovered was the story of the Chinese labourers brought in to build the Panama Railway. And not only were they dying from disease, but they all started committing suicide and asking their fellows to chop their heads off, because they were all heroin addicts who didn't have any heroin, so they were all doing cold turkey. The conditions were absolutely awful. The food was completely different from what they were used to, and the death rate was 75-80% or something, and the survivors were shipped off to the Caribbean because they realised these people were completely unsuitable for the railway. Now, oddly enough, the Chinese were then very successful at building the American transcontinental railway some 20 years later, and was shipped in large amounts to San Francisco to build that. So different stories, but I suppose that's what's wonderful about the whole history of the development of the railways, is that there's these fascinating little bits of social history. So there was certainly a vast amount of blood expended, and then I suppose the gold of the title is again pretty obvious. There was a lot of money made by a lot of people, not least those who built the first American transcontinental railway, who absolutely creamed off millions of dollars for the simple expedient of creating a supplier company that did all the construction work, and then they could really charge whatever they wanted for that construction work, take the money off the main company, and of course the people actually owned the supplier company as well, so they'd make all the profits there and say, well, it cost so and so to build this, but we're making all the profit there, And funnily enough, the records of one of the Pacific railways, I forget which, were all burnt out, but just a couple of years after the railroad was finished, before they ever managed to investigate where all the money went.